They thought she would win. They believed with every fiber of their orchestrated campaign that this case would end in complete victory. They had the press, they had the lawyers, they had the narrative sculpted word for word into a polished image, ready for the world to consume and believe. Blake Lively was never supposed to lose in their eyes. In her own eyes, it was a foregone conclusion. The courtroom had been stacked with presents. The public relations teams whispered to reporters behind the scenes, shaping headlines before any verdict was even read. The whispers said she would win. The whispers said Jed Wallace would crumble, that his countersuit would fail, and that this entire mess would be forgotten by the time the next awards season began. But what no one saw coming was the stillness in the courtroom when the judge returned. When he stared directly at Blake before speaking, and when he spoke, he did not praise her. He did not agree with her attorneys. He did not validate the pile of paper their team had thrown together as evidence. Instead, he dismissed it entirely. His words, like blades slicing through a decade of carefully curated image maintenance. The case is hereby dismissed with prejudice. The courtroom gasped. Not because they were shocked by the legal language, but because of what that language meant. It meant the court didn't just reject the case, it meant the court believed it never should have been brought at all. It meant that Blake Lively and her team had wasted the time of the court, the resources of the system, and worse yet, the trust of the people who followed the story hoping for truth. What followed was a silence so loud it felt like it would never end. Jed Wallace didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He sat there breathing quietly, as if every exhale carried 10 pounds of relief, because he knew what this meant. He knew that after months of being labeled a manipulator, a liar, a threat, after months of sleepless nights wondering if his career, his reputation, his future would be scorched by the fire she lit, it was finally over, and not just over, vindicated. Because this case was never about justice, this case was about destruction, and the judge knew it. The evidence showed it, and now the world was beginning to understand it too. Blake didn't move right away. She sat frozen, unmoving, her jaw clenched, her hands tight enough to turn her knuckles white. The cameras waited outside, the photographers sharpening their lenses and adjusting for light, but Blake didn't walk out like she had walked in. Her entrance had been an act of power, the kind of practice strut only years of red carpets and movie sets could teach. She arrived flanked by attorney stylists whispering into her ear, hair perfectly swept, makeup designed to say confidence without arrogance. Today's look curated for court, innocence crafted into fashion. But that wasn't how she left the building. She left through a side door, security moving quickly. Her team huddled close, their phones out, their eyes down. The crowd never saw her face, and that was no accident. She didn't want the world to see her unravel. She didn't want anyone capturing what this moment truly meant, and yet even without the photo evidence, the unraveling had already begun, because news spreads faster than any publicist can contain it, and before she could even reach the car outside, Twitter was already aflame. Headlines were already being drafted. Former allies were already distancing themselves, and inside, Jed Wallace was taking his first real breath in what felt like forever. This wasn't just a legal victory. This was a public moment of clarity, a moment that turned the entire narrative upside down, because now people wanted to know why. Why would Blake Lively launch a lawsuit with no real evidence? Why would she allow her legal team to spin a story that couldn't survive even the first wave of scrutiny? Why would someone with so much to lose take such a reckless path? And the answer is darker than anyone imagined, because this wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of a cover-up, a desperate attempt to silence someone who knew too much, someone who was once close enough to her to see the cracks in her perfectly polished surface. And what Jed Wallace knew was not just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Not just to her reputation, but to the people around her, to the machine that profits from her image, to the executives that funded the marketers who sell it, the influencers who replicate it. And in trying to destroy him, she triggered a chain reaction, one that couldn't be stopped, not by a dismissal, not by a settlement, and certainly not by hiding in the backseat of a tinted black car driving away from a courthouse surrounded by chaos. Because chaos was only beginning. The court documents revealed far more than Blake intended, and those documents are now public. The testimonies, the timelines, the inconsistencies, the missing files, the redacted pages, and every page leads to more questions. Why was key communication between Blake and her agents deleted? Why were emails from her former assistants suddenly retracted? Why did a former publicist issue a non-disclosure order just weeks before the trial began? And why were there anonymous payments sent to minor witnesses who suddenly changed their stories? And all of it points to something deeper, something organized, something protected by more than just a legal team, something fueled by fear and driven by control, because the empire surrounding Blake Lively is not just about one actress, it's about a multi-billion-dollar industry built on illusion, and Jed Wallace was never supposed to break that illusion. But now he has, and Blake's loss in court is more than just a dismissal, it's a warning. Shout to everyone who thought the truth would stay buried, because the truth is clawing its way to the surface, and what comes next will make this dismissal look like a mere opening act. In part 2, we'll break down the confidential emails between Blake and her crisis manager and expose the midnight meeting that may have tipped the judge off to the real story, unraveling behind the scenes what happened behind the courtroom door before the judge returned is what truly shifted everything. What was supposed to be a carefully planned day, where Blake Lively's team would deliver a final devastating blow to Jed Wallace, suddenly began to show cracks. The kind of cracks that don't form naturally, the kind that signal someone inside was no longer playing by the script. It started with a document, a single email introduced into the record during a late-night evidence submission, something the judge hadn't seen before, something the prosecution never expected to surface. An internal communication between Blake's personal crisis manager and her legal team, marked strictly confidential, dated only 2 days before the lawsuit was officially filed. In that email were lines that shocked even the court clerk. One read, "We need to ensure Mr. Wallace never sees the light of day again." Another said, "The media plan is in motion, the narratives will match the charges," and that alone was enough to send the room into quiet panic, because those words weren't about justice, they were about destruction, the kind orchestrated in silence and shadows, the kind where public perception is weaponized and truth is restructured to protect a name, a brand, and a billion-dollar machine. And though Blake was not the one who typed the message, it was traced back to her command. The judge asked a simple question in chambers: who authorized the strategy? And the response he received off the record changed everything. It triggered an emergency review of evidence, and suddenly the tone of the court shifted. And while the public didn't see the change behind the scenes, the gears of justice began turning in a new direction, one not controlled by the publicists or the producers or the legal strategists, but by cold hard fact. And once that shift began, things started crumbling fast, because buried within a pile of seemingly irrelevant documents was a travel log, a schedule that placed Blake in New York on a date she had sworn under oath to be in Los Angeles, and that discrepancy was small but devastating, because it invalidated a full day of her testimony, and worse still, it cast doubt on everything else she said. The judge began to examine each claim with a new lens, and every discrepancy, every oddity suddenly became fuel for dismissal. Now, as the walls closed and her team met in secret rooms, they tried to find exits, legal ones, social ones, anything that could allow her to walk away without complete ruin. They proposed sealed settlements, they hinted at public apologies, they even floated the idea of blaming rogue employees, but it was too late. The story was no longer under their control. And then came the midnight meeting, the one that broke the spine of the case once and for all. In a private chamber just after 10 p.m., 2 attorneys, one from each side, were called, and the judge had questions about a subpoenaed document that still had not been delivered, an interview transcript taken weeks earlier involving one of Blake's former assistants who had been present during an alleged altercation between her and Jed. And though Blake's team had promised the transcript was irrelevant, the judge disagreed, and when he finally received it from a court assistant who had tracked down the original source, his expression reportedly turned cold, because the transcript revealed not only had the assistant denied witnessing any wrongdoing by Jed, but that she had been coached on how to phrase her uncertainty in public interviews. The word manipulated appeared 7 times in the assistant's statement, and all of them referred to Blake's media strategy. And that was the moment the judge knew he had no choice, because courts don't exist to serve as battlegrounds for celebrity image rehabilitation. And with that realization, the rest followed like dominoes. The evidence fell apart, the inconsistencies stacked up, and Blake's legal team was no longer fighting to win, they were fighting to survive. And the panic spread fast. Whispers about her management team began leaking, industry insiders began tweeting cryptic messages, producers removed her name from upcoming deals, advertisers paused campaigns, even her brand partnerships sent urgent emails asking for reassurances. The collapse wasn't just legal, it was total. And while Blake remained silent publicly, behind the scenes, she was reportedly in shock, unable to process how fast the walls had come down. And while she hid away from the cameras, the internet did not wait. Within minutes of the dismissal, social media was ablaze. Jed Wallace was trending not as a villain, but as a man wrongfully accused and victorious against impossible odds. Fans rallied around him, journalists began digging, and within 24 hours articles emerged. Not about the trial, but about the system that enabled Blake to launch it in the first place. One former studio executive who requested anonymity said off the record, "This has been a long time coming. She's been protected for years because she generates headlines, not because she's innocent," and that quote alone was enough to spark a storm of speculation. Suddenly everyone who had ever worked with Blake was being asked for comment. And most declined, but a few spoke up. One former assistant posted a thread on social media, describing the intense pressure to lie under oath and how fear of retaliation kept many silent, and that thread went viral, racking up millions of views in hours, further destroying the carefully curated myth of Blake as Hollywood's untouchable queen. And through it all, Jed remained mostly quiet, issuing only a short statement thanking his supporters and expressing relief that the truth had finally been recognized. And while that may have been the end of the trial, it was only the beginning of the reckoning, because now attention turned to how Blake had managed to build a case on such flimsy ground, and the answer was chilling, because it wasn't flimsy, it was deliberate, a web of calculated moves designed to isolate, discredit, and bury a man who had once worked within our circle and whose only crime had been speaking the wrong truth to the wrong person. And as journalists began investigating, they uncovered layers of deception going back years, from PR spin jobs to quiet payoffs, from hidden NDAs to sudden firings of anyone who didn't follow orders. And slowly a picture began to form, one that showed this trial was not an accident. It was a pattern, a continuation of a long-standing playbook used by powerful people to silence those who threatened their carefully crafted narrative. And now, with her case dismissed, her strategy exposed, and her inner circle unraveling, Blake Lively faced the most dangerous enemy of all, reality. And it wasn't going anywhere. In Part 3, we'll follow the money trail from hidden legal payments to PR bribes and reveal which major Hollywood names were secretly involved in protecting Blake's campaign to silence Jed Wallace, and why those same names are now running for cover. The whispers started with a spreadsheet, something nobody outside the inner legal team was ever supposed to see, but when a junior analyst accidentally uploaded it to a shared folder and someone with clearance flagged the discrepancies, the ripple effect it caused turned a scandal into a full-scale reckoning. The document was called Expenses Phase 2, but what stood out wasn't just the amount of money being moved, it was who was getting paid and why. At first glance it looked like standard legal disbursements, reimbursements for travel, expert witnesses, security fees, but buried between line items was a different set of payments marked confidential, outreach, non-disclosure strategy. And the amounts weren't small, they were massive, five-figure sums wired to boutique PR firms, former assistants, media consultants, and even one transaction to a freelance investigator who later admitted off-record that he had been asked to dig up compromising material on Jed Wallace, including financial records and personal communications. And while he claimed he never followed through, the request alone was enough to raise alarms, because it painted a clear picture. This wasn't a case built on justice, it was built on destruction, weaponized with money and access. And when the spreadsheet reached the judge's inbox, thanks to a whistleblower, the courtroom tone changed again. What had already begun unraveling now exploded, and with that explosion came names nobody expected to be involved, household names, industry legends, producers, casting directors, and studio executives, who were connected not just to Blake but to each other through a long pattern of silence and collaboration. Because the money didn't just flow from her team, it came from connected entities, production companies that shared backers with her upcoming films, agencies that had clients who once clashed with Jed Wallace, even streaming platforms rumored to have negotiated exclusive deals with her, all quietly chipping in to support a lawsuit that was supposed to be open shut and reputation saving. And now those companies were on defense, issuing statements of neutrality, pulling out of pending deals, deleting social media posts that tied them too closely to the case. And all the while, investigative journalists kept digging, finding emails between Blake's lawyer and a PR firm head that read, "If this gets out, we all burn." And suddenly, people who had remained loyal out of fear began to talk. One former publicist leaked an internal memo from 2 years ago, detailing crisis strategy protocols for Blake, which included instructions on how to preemptively discredit dissenting voices, especially male colleagues and collaborators. And once that memo became public, the backlash reached a new level. Celebrities started unfollowing her, producers began issuing denials of involvement, and even longtime friends stayed publicly silent, unwilling to attach themselves to a name that had become toxic. And as this chaos unfolded, Jed Wallace stayed composed, declining interview offers, refusing to feed the media frenzy, choosing instead to release only a single Quote through his lawyer, "Truth needs no decoration, it only needs time," and now that time has come, and that quote went viral, appearing on protest signs. Trending on social media, etched into graffiti outside studios, it became more than a statement. It became a movement because what the public now understood was that Jed wasn't the only one targeted. There were others, creatives who had once tried to speak out against Blake's behavior but were silenced through smear campaigns or blacklisted from opportunities, and now with the money trail exposed, they were coming forward one by one, anonymously at first, but then more boldly with names, dates, emails, screenshots showing how influence had been used not to protect innocence but to engineer outcomes. And one former assistant who had been paid a severance package with a strict NDA broke that agreement and released a video detailing the pressure she faced to lie in depositions, and in that video she said, "I watched truth be rewritten. In real time, I watched fear control everyone," and that video exploded, reaching 10 million views in under 48 hours, prompting a congressional inquiry into Hollywood legal abuse practices, and with politicians now entering the conversation, the stakes escalated beyond entertainment and into a national conversation about power abuse, privilege, and the manipulation of justice. And through it all, Blake Lively remained silent, appearing only once in public, shielded by security, ignoring the shouted questions of reporters who demanded answers. And in that moment, as she slipped into a waiting black SUV, the symbolism was undeniable. Hollywood's golden image running from accountability, and behind closed doors, sources say her team was in disarray, lawyers resigning, consultants fleeing, and crisis managers issuing new invoices for damage control that seemed far too late. And as internal emails leaked showing her awareness of certain strategies, the narrative shifted once again. From Blake being misled to Blake being in control because ignorance was no longer plausible. Now with so many layers, so many fingerprints, so much coordination, and as the money trail connected even further, revealing ties to lobbying groups and legal lobbying strategies built to delay court processes, the judge issued a rare post-verdict statement, condemning the abuse of civil litigation for personal branding, and in doing so he sent a message. This was no longer just about Jed Wallace or Blake Lively, it was about the system and the people who kept it running, and that system was now on trial too. And in part 4 we reveal how internal recordings from Blake Lively's own crisis team prove she knew exactly how far the plan had gone, and how those recordings ended up in the hands of someone who had every reason to burn her entire empire down. The tapes were never supposed to exist, recorded secretly by a disillusioned member of Blake Lively's inner crisis team. These audio files captured everything: strategy sessions, name drops, panic reactions, and worst of all, admissions in Blake's own voice, calm, calculated, and laced with frustration. She spoke about Jed Wallace as if he were an obstacle to be cleared, not a human being. And when the first recording leaked onto a whistleblower platform verified by 3 forensic analysts and cross-referenced with internal meeting logs, the world froze. The audio opened with her saying, "If we don't finish him now, he will finish me." And that wasn't just a metaphor, it was a plan, a signal to mobilize every resource her team had to ensure he was silenced. The recordings featured conversations between Blake's lawyers, publicists, and private investigators, all laying out a timeline and narrative to bury Jed Wallace permanently. Strategies included staged leaks, influencer partnerships to see negative sentiment, and even planting fake stories in entertainment tabloids alleging misconduct on his part, which they thought the courtroom loss would be the end of it, a footnote in a long line of celebrity dramas quickly replaced by the next scandal, the next headline. But what they didn't anticipate was how deeply this case would cut, not just through Blake Lively's carefully constructed image, but through the very foundation of power in Hollywood. Because this wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a reckoning. It was the moment the curtain fell and the audience finally saw the machinery behind the performance, the manipulation, the silence, the fear, and in that raw, unfiltered light, the myth shattered. For good people didn't just walk away from her, they walked away from the system that protected her, that enabled her, that turned cruelty into strategy and silence into loyalty. This was bigger than one woman. This was about every whispered warning, every buried truth, every career destroyed for refusing to play along. And when the fixers let her crack the wall, the flood of truth drowned every excuse, every justification, every carefully rehearsed lie. And in that flood, something new emerged. Not just justice, but awakening, a demand for change, for accountability, for humanity in an industry that had long forgotten its soul. And now as Blake sits alone, her empire in ruins, her legacy in question, what echoes loudest is not the scandal or the recordings or the court decision, it's the voices that rose From the shadows, finally heard, finally believed, and finally free. And that is the ending she never saw coming, because the story was never hers to control, it was ours to tell, and we're just getting started.